August 6, 1945 found Staff Sergeant Henry Red Irwin hunched in the radio operator's compartment of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, 30,000 feet above the Japanese mainland. The 23-year-old Alabaman could feel the vibrations of the Wright Cyclone engines through the aluminum fuselage as his aircraft, call sign Able 13, thundered through the pre-dawn darkness. Red hadn't slept properly in 3 days. None of the crew had. They were flying their 8th combat mission in 2 weeks, part of General Curtis LeMay's relentless firebombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The date etched itself into Red's consciousness not because of what would happen to him in the next 22 seconds, but because somewhere far to the south, another B-29 called Enola Gay was preparing for a mission that would reshape human history. Red knew nothing of atomic weapons or secret projects. He knew only the cramped steel tube that was his world, the smell of aviation fuel and sweat, and the faces of the 11 men who shared his fate at 23,000 feet. Captain Tony Simmerall, the aircraft commander, was a veteran of 32 missions, a lifetime in the savage mathematics of the air war. His orders that morning were straightforward: lead a formation of 14 B-29s to Koriyama, a mid-sized city 140 miles north of Tokyo, and incinerate it. The tactic was brutal but effective. LeMay had discovered that Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, burned with terrifying efficiency. One well-placed incendiary could start a firestorm that would consume entire neighborhoods. Red's station was in the forward section of the aircraft, behind the pilots, and just aft of the bombardier's position. As radio operator, he also served as the lead formation smoke light operator, a role that would transform from routine to catastrophic in ways no one could have predicted. His job involved handling phosphorus smoke bombs, small cylindrical devices about the size of a thermos bottle. These bombs served a critical tactical purpose. When dropped and ignited, they created brilliant white plumes of smoke that marked the formation leader, allowing the other B-29s to maintain their bombing patterns even in the darkness or through cloud cover. According to military records preserved at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, the phosphorus bombs contained white phosphorus suspended in a rubber solution, a substance that ignited spontaneously upon contact with oxygen and burned at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The bombs were equipped with a simple ignition system. A pull pin would start a chemical fuse that burned for 20 to 30 seconds before igniting the main phosphorus charge. At 0550 hours, with Koriyama's dark outline visible below and the first hints of dawn breaking over the Pacific, Captain Simmerall's voice crackled through the intercom. "Irwin, prepare smoke bomb. Mark on my signal." Red reached for the metal tube secured in its mounting bracket beside his station. The bomb felt cold through his gloves, just another piece of equipment in a mission that had become almost routine. He had no way of knowing that in 22 seconds he would be blind, burning, and fighting to save 12 lives. The phosphorus bomb felt no different than the dozens Red Irwin had handled during training and previous missions. He withdrew the device from its bracket, his movements practiced and precise despite the cramped quarters and the constant vibration of the engines. Standard procedure required him to pull the ignition pin, count to 3 to ensure the chemical fuse had started burning properly, then drop the bomb down the chute that would send it tumbling through the darkness toward the ground below. Red pulled the pin. What happened next occurred so fast that no one aboard Able 13 could process it in real time. Instead of the bomb dropping cleanly through the chute, something went catastrophically wrong. The malfunction was later attributed to a combination of factors: a gust of wind hitting the aircraft at precisely the wrong moment, a slight misalignment of the chute mechanism, or possibly a defect in the bomb itself. Whatever the cause, instead of falling away from the aircraft, the activated phosphorus bomb ricocheted off the lip of the chute and flew directly backward into Red's face. The impact knocked him sprawling. For perhaps 1 full second, an eternity in the compressed timeline of disaster, Red didn't understand what had happened. Then the chemical fuse reached its terminus, and the white phosphorus ignited against his face and chest. Military medical reports from the subsequent investigation, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, describe white phosphorus burns as among the most horrific injuries imaginable. The substance doesn't simply burn, it adheres to skin, clothing, and any organic material, continuing to consume tissue as long as oxygen is present. The pain is immediate and overwhelming. The smoke is toxic, capable of causing chemical pneumonia and asphyxiation, and the fire cannot be extinguished by conventional means. Water only produces more smoke and heat. Red Irwin began to scream. The phosphorus had ignited across his face, searing through his eyes, nose, and mouth. His flight suit burst into flames. The rubber solution in the bomb melted into his skin, creating a burning mass that no amount of thrashing could dislodge. Within seconds, the radio compartment filled with thick, choking white smoke. The smell, a horrible combination of burning flesh, rubber, and the garlicky odor of phosphorus, flooded through the aircraft's ventilation system. From the cockpit, Captain Cimarol heard the screams and saw white smoke billowing through the aircraft. His first thought was that they'd taken a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire. His second thought, as the smoke grew thicker and he realized his instruments were disappearing in the white haze, was that they were all about to die. The smoke wasn't just obscuring vision, it was toxic. Sergeant Herbert Schnipper, the flight engineer, later testified that within 10 seconds, breathing became difficult. Within 20 seconds, he couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. The pilots, completely blind, lost all reference to the horizon. At 23,000 feet, flying in formation with 13 other aircraft, losing visual reference was a death sentence. They could collide with another B-29, spiral into the ocean, or simply lose control and enter a flat spin. In the radio compartment, something extraordinary was happening. Despite pain that medical experts would later describe as beyond the normal human capacity to endure, despite being blind and on fire, Red Irwin was thinking. The burning phosphorus bomb had fallen to the floor of the compartment after bouncing off his face. Every second it remained inside the aircraft brought them closer to catastrophe. The smoke would overcome the crew. The fire would spread to fuel lines or oxygen systems. They would all die, either from asphyxiation, fire, or loss of control. Red's hands, also burning, found the bomb on the floor. What Red Irwin did next defied every natural human instinct. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to get away from the source of his agony, to collapse, to surrender to the overwhelming trauma consuming him. Medical science tells us that severe burns trigger an immediate shock response. The body's desperate attempt to shut down, to protect the brain from unendurable pain. Red should have been unconscious. He should have been immobilized by burns that were actively destroying the tissue of his hands, arms, face, and chest. Instead, he picked up the burning bomb and began to crawl. The geography of a B-29 superfortress becomes crucial to understanding the magnitude of Red's action. The aircraft was over 99 feet long, with a pressurized cabin divided into 3 sections connected by a narrow crawlway that ran above the bomb bays. From the radio operator's position to the pilot's compartment was approximately 15 feet, a trivial distance under normal circumstances. But Red Irwin wasn't facing normal circumstances. He was blind. The phosphorus had destroyed his eyes, melting through the delicate tissues and searing his optic nerves. He was holding a burning mass of metal and chemicals that was now welded to the flesh of his hands, a bomb that was consuming him even as he clutched it. He had to navigate through smoke so thick that crew members later said it was like being inside a milk bottle, and he had to do it all while his body was actively burning, the phosphorus eating deeper into his tissue with every passing second. Technical Sergeant George Miranda, the navigator, was the first crew member Red encountered. Miranda later described the scene in a sworn statement preserved in military records. He heard what sounded like an animal in pain, then saw a burning figure emerging from the white smoke, crawling forward on its hands and knees. Miranda's first instinct was to help, but Red, unable to speak through his destroyed mouth and throat, somehow communicated through gesture and movement that he needed to get past, not be stopped. The crawlway was 29 inches in diameter. Red had to pull himself forward with his burning hands while simultaneously keeping the phosphorus bomb away from the aluminum skin of the aircraft. If the bomb touched the fuselage, it could burn through, depressurizing the cabin or igniting fuel lines. If he dropped it, the crew behind him would be consumed by smoke and flame. His only option was to hold on and keep moving. Captain Simmerl, flying blind in the cockpit, had reduced power and was trying desperately to maintain level flight. The smoke was so thick he couldn't see his co-pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Rowe, sitting 3 feet away. Through the intercom, barely audible over the screaming and the roar of the engines, Simmerl heard someone shout, "He's coming forward! Don't stop him!" Red reached the bulkhead door leading to the cockpit. Under normal circumstances, opening this door required 2 hands, clear vision, and considerable dexterity. It was designed as a pressure door, sealed tight. With his hands fused to the burning bomb, blind and suffering from injuries that would kill most men within minutes, Red somehow got the door open. Some crew members later speculated he used his shoulder or his head. Others thought maybe someone reached through the smoke to help. Red himself would never remember this part. His memory stopped sometime during the crawl. He stumbled into the cockpit, and Simmerl saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A human figure, barely recognizable as such, burning from head to waist, holding a ball of white fire in its outstretched hands. Through destroyed lips, Red somehow formed words. "Window, window, get rid of." The cockpit of a B-29 superfortress at 23,000 feet is not designed for quick decisions made in smoke and chaos. Captain Simmerl, still unable to see more than vague shapes through the toxic white haze filling his aircraft, had to process what was happening in fragments of information. A burning man was in his cockpit. The burning man was holding something. The burning man needed a window opened. Which window? Why? And most critically, could they open any window at this altitude without catastrophic consequences? The B-29 was a pressurized aircraft, one of the first strategic bombers to incorporate this technology. At 23,000 feet, the air pressure inside the cabin was artificially maintained at a level equivalent to 8,000 feet elevation. Breathable, comfortable, survivable. Outside the thin aluminum skin, the atmosphere was hostile to human life. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. The air pressure was too low to sustain consciousness. Opening a window at this altitude was something pilots simply didn't do during flight. But Red Irwin was dying in front of them, holding a bomb that was killing them all. First Lieutenant Rowe, the co-pilot, made a decision that showed remarkable clarity under impossible circumstances. The small sliding window on the pilot's side of the cockpit, designed primarily for visibility during ground operations, could be opened from the inside. It was small, perhaps 8 inches wide and 12 inches tall, but it was an opening. Rowe reached across Simmerl and slammed the window open. The effect was immediate and violent. The pressure differential between the cabin and the outside air created a howling vortex. Documents, maps, and loose equipment whipped around the cockpit. The sudden decompression made breathing even more difficult for men already choking on phosphorus smoke. The temperature in the cockpit, already uncomfortable, plummeted. But more importantly, the rushing air began to clear the smoke, pulling it out through the open window. Red, still functioning on some level beyond normal human consciousness, lifted the burning bomb toward the window. His hands, according to medical records compiled after the mission, had essentially become part of the bomb itself. The phosphorus had melted through his gloves and into his flesh, creating a fused mass of metal, chemical, and tissue. The pain should have been impossible to function through, yet Red raised his arms and pushed the burning device toward the small opening. It didn't fit. The window was too small. The bomb, with Red's hands fused around it, was too large to pass through the narrow gap. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Red stood in the cockpit, blind and burning, unable to complete the one task that might save them all. Behind him, the smoke was beginning to clear enough for the crew to see the extent of his injuries, and what they saw made several men physically ill. He stumbled into the cockpit, and Simmerl saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A human figure, barely recognizable as such, burning from head to waist, holding a ball of white fire in its outstretched hands. Staff Sergeant Horace Crosby, the left gunner who had worked his way forward to help, later testified that Red's face was gone. Not burned. Gone. Where there should have been features, there was only raw, blackened tissue and exposed bone. His eyes were destroyed. His nose was a cavity. His lips and most of his cheeks had been consumed by the phosphorus. His flight suit had burned away from his torso, and the white phosphorus was still actively burning, working its way deeper into his chest cavity. Yet Red adjusted his grip, tilted the bomb at an angle, and pushed harder. The bomb went through the window, taking portions of Red's hands with it. The phosphorus device tumbled away into the frozen air, trailing white smoke as it fell toward the Japanese countryside below. The immediate threat was gone, but Red Irwin was still on fire. The moment the phosphorus bomb cleared the aircraft, Captain Simmerl faced a new set of impossible choices. Red Irwin was dying in his cockpit. That much was obvious to everyone who could see him through the clearing smoke. But they were still deep over enemy territory, flying in formation with 13 other B-29s, and their mission was not complete. Military doctrine was clear. The needs of the mission superseded individual casualties. Simmerl should have ordered Red moved to the rear of the aircraft, continued with the bombing run, and dealt with the medical emergency after they were safely away from Japanese airspace. Tony Simmerl was not a man who followed doctrine when doctrine meant watching a subordinate die. Within seconds of the bomb clearing the window, he made a decision that would later cause considerable controversy with his superiors. He broke formation, banked the aircraft hard to the south, and called out over the radio that they were aborting the mission due to medical emergency. The other aircraft would have to complete the bombing run without their formation leader. First Lieutenant Rowe grabbed the first aid kit from its mounting behind the pilot's seat. The kit, designed for treating minor injuries and stabilizing crew members until they could return to base, was comically inadequate for what they were facing. It contained bandages, sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, and a few basic medical supplies. Nothing in the kit addressed burns that had consumed most of a man's face and hands, or how to deal with white phosphorus that was still actively burning inside tissue. The morphine syrettes became the first priority. Rowe tried to inject Red with pain medication but couldn't find undamaged tissue. Red's arms were burned, his legs were burned, and his torso was still actively on fire in places where the phosphorus had soaked through his flight suit. Finally, Rowe managed to inject morphine into Red's thigh, pushing the needle through charred fabric and into muscle. He emptied 2 syrettes, doubled the recommended dose, into Red's system. It didn't seem to have any effect. Red was still conscious, still moaning in agony, and beginning to convulse from shock. Technical Sergeant Miranda, the navigator who had witnessed Red's crawl through the smoke, brought wet cloths from the galley area, anything to try to stop the burning. But white phosphorus doesn't respond to water the way normal fires do. The wet cloths created more smoke and seemed to cause Red more pain. Someone suggested smothering the burns with blankets, but that risked letting the phosphorus continue burning beneath the covers, consuming what little viable tissue remained. Staff Sergeant William Monk, the bombardier, had been through combat first aid training and had seen men injured in previous missions. He took one look at Red and knew they were far beyond anything training had prepared them for. The standard treatment for phosphorus burns, which Monk had learned during a brief lecture months ago, involved coating the affected area with copper sulfate solution to convert the phosphorus to a less reactive compound. They didn't have copper sulfate solution. What they had was a dying man, 3 hours of flight time back to base, and medical supplies designed for bandaging minor wounds. Simmerl pushed the B-29 to its maximum continuous speed. The aircraft, designed to cruise at 230 miles per hour, shuddered as Simmerl coaxed it past 280. He descended to a lower altitude where the air was denser and easier to breathe, gambling that they wouldn't encounter Japanese fighters. The open cockpit window continued to howl, pulling heat from the cabin and making everyone's teeth chatter, but no one suggested closing it. The memory of the smoke was too fresh. Red's condition deteriorated rapidly. The morphine finally seemed to take some edge off his consciousness, but this created a new problem. He stopped moving, stopped responding, and appeared to be slipping into a coma. Rowe checked for a pulse and found it weak and irregular. Red's breathing became labored, each inhalation producing a horrible gurgling sound as air moved through damaged tissue and blood in his throat. At 0720 hours, With Red Irwin clinging to life by threads that seemed ready to snap at any moment, Captain Cimmerl spotted the volcanic outline of Iwo Jima rising from the Pacific. The island, captured by American forces in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War just 5 months earlier, had been transformed into an emergency landing strip for damaged B-29s returning from missions over Japan. Its 8,000 feet of runway, purchased with the lives of nearly 7,000 Marines, had already saved hundreds of bomber crew members. Cimmerl radioed ahead that he had a critical casualty aboard and needed medical personnel standing by. The response crackled back through static. They should divert to North Field, where the base hospital was located. But Cimmerl could see South Field's runway closer, and every minute mattered. He ignored the instruction and lined up his approach for South Field, knowing he'd face questions about disobeying direct orders, but not caring about consequences that seemed trivial compared to the dying man behind him. The landing was rough. Cimmerl, exhausted from 3 hours of high-speed flight and still dealing with reduced visibility from smoke residue coating the cockpit windows, brought the B-29 down hard. The main gear hit the coral runway with enough force to bounce the aircraft back into the air. The second touchdown was better, and Cimmerl stood on the brakes, desperate to stop the massive bomber as quickly as possible. Before the aircraft had completely stopped rolling, the crew had the forward hatch open. Lieutenant Rowe was screaming for a medical team, his voice hoarse from breathing smoke and yelling over engine noise. What emerged from the B-29 shocked even the hardened combat medics who had seen thousands of casualties during the battle for Iwo Jima. Navy Corpsman Second Class James Patterson later provided a statement for military records, describing Red Irwin as the worst burn case I had ever seen that was still alive. Patterson had treated Marines who had been caught by flamethrowers during cave-clearing operations. He had seen men burned by naval gunfire and accidents with fuel. Nothing had prepared him for the extent and type of injuries Red had sustained. The white phosphorus had continued burning during the 3-hour flight, working its way deeper into Red's tissue. His face was, in Patterson's words, no longer recognizable as human. Both eyes were destroyed. His nose was gone. His ears were burned down to charred remnants. His mouth was a cavity with exposed teeth and bone. The medical team initially didn't want to move him, fearing that any movement might kill him. Red's breathing had become so labored that Patterson thought he might suffocate before they could get him to the hospital. They administered oxygen, started intravenous fluids, and gave him additional morphine, his 4th dose in 3 hours. Military medical protocols from that era generally prohibited such high doses of morphine, but the protocols assumed patients with a reasonable chance of survival. Most of the medics looking at Red Irwin believed they were simply trying to ease his final minutes. The ambulance ride to the base hospital covered less than 2 miles but took nearly 15 minutes. The driver, Corporal Michael Hendricks, later recalled having to stop twice when Red's breathing became so irregular that Patterson thought he had died. Each time, the corpsman managed to resuscitate him through a combination of oxygen and physical stimulation. Hendricks remembered thinking that they should let the poor man die, that keeping him alive was cruelty, not mercy. At the hospital, Commander David Steinberg, the senior surgeon on duty, took one look at Red and immediately began planning for emergency surgery. The primary concern wasn't saving Red's face or hands. Those were almost certainly beyond salvage. The concern was that the phosphorus was still burning inside his chest cavity, working its way toward vital organs. If it reached his lungs, heart, or major blood vessels, no surgery could save him. They had to remove the phosphorus-contaminated tissue, and they had to do it immediately. Commander Steinberg faced a medical problem that existed at the far edge of surgical possibility. White phosphorus embedded in tissue doesn't behave like other foreign objects. It can't be simply removed with forceps and irrigation. It continues to burn as long as oxygen is present, which means that every time Steinberg would cut into Red's tissue to access the contaminated areas, he would be exposing the phosphorus to fresh air and accelerating the burning. The surgery itself could kill the patient faster than doing nothing. The medical facilities at Iwo Jima, while adequate for standard combat casualties, weren't equipped for the kind of extensive burn treatment Red needed. The hospital had been set up to stabilize patients before flying them to larger facilities in Guam or Hawaii. They had basic surgical capabilities, blood supplies, and antibiotics, but not burn specialists, not skin graft materials, and not the kind of specialized equipment that might give Red a realistic chance at survival. Steinberg assembled a team of 3 nurses and 2 additional surgeons. They moved Red into the operating theater at 09:15 hours, roughly 8 hours after the phosphorus bomb had exploded in his face. Those 8 hours of continued burning had caused damage that extended far beyond the original injury site. The phosphorus had worked its way through Red's facial tissue and into his sinuses. It had burned through his chest muscles and was approaching his ribcage. His hands were essentially gone, the bones were intact, but most of the soft tissue had been consumed. The surgical team had to make immediate decisions about what tissue could be saved and what had to be removed. Steinberg made the decision to begin with Red's face, working on the principle that stopping the phosphorus from reaching his brain was the highest priority. Using scalpels and surgical scissors, they began the horrible work of cutting away dead and contaminated tissue. The phosphorus, when exposed during the surgery, would reignite. Nurses stood by with wet compresses to smother the flames, but this created clouds of toxic smoke that filled the operating room. The surgical team worked in masks, their eyes streaming tears from the irritation. Twice they had to pause the surgery to ventilate the room. Once, a piece of phosphorus-contaminated tissue fell on the operating table and started burning through the wooden surface. A nurse grabbed it with forceps and threw it into a bucket of water where it continued to smolder. Red's vital signs crashed repeatedly during the surgery. His blood pressure would drop to levels incompatible with life, his heart rate would become erratic, and the anesthesiologist would call out warnings that they were losing him. Each time, Steinberg would pause, the team would administer stimulants and fluids, and somehow Red's body would rally. After the 3rd such crisis, Steinberg told his team that he had never seen anyone survive this level of trauma, and that he believed they were witnessing something medically impossible. The surgery lasted 7 hours. By the time Steinberg closed the last incision, they had removed what he estimated as 40% of the soft tissue from Red's face, neck, and chest. Both of Red's eyes had been surgically removed. They were too damaged to save, and leaving them in place risked infection spreading to his brain. His nose and most of his left ear were gone. His hands had been debrided down to bone in several places. The surgical team had used every unit of plasma and whole blood available at the hospital, supplementing Red's blood volume as they worked. When they wheeled Red out of surgery into recovery, Steinberg made an entry in the medical log that would later be cited in numerous military medical journals. He wrote, "Patient survived procedure, but prognosis remains grave. Extensive 4th-degree burns covering approximately 35% of body surface area. Both eyes enucleated. Bilateral hand injuries consistent with 4th-degree burns. Patient placed on suicide watch not for psychological reasons, but because infection, organ failure, or respiratory failure will likely prove fatal within 72 hours. Recommend next of kin notification and preparation for death." Red Irwin regained consciousness 36 hours after the surgery, emerging into a darkness that would be permanent. The morphine had worn off enough for his brain to process information, but not enough to shield him from pain that the attending nurses described as beyond their capacity to imagine. His first coherent thought, according to statements he would make weeks later, was confusion about why he was still alive. The medical staff at Iwo Jima had, in fact, begun treating Red as a terminal patient. His bed was placed in a private room, a courtesy extended to dying men so they wouldn't disturb other patients during their final hours. A chaplain visited 3 times in the first 2 days, offering prayers and comfort. The staff changed his bandages with the gentleness of people who believed they were providing palliative care rather than treatment. No one spoke to him about recovery, physical therapy, or the future, because no one believed he had a future. But Red didn't die. His temperature, which had spiked to 105 degrees in the immediate post-surgical period, gradually stabilized. His breathing, which had been so labored that nurses expected him to suffocate at any moment, slowly became more regular. Most remarkably, the infection that everyone assumed would kill him, burns are notorious for becoming infected, and 4th-degree burns covering 35% of the body should have been a death sentence in the antibiotic era of 1945, never developed into the septic catastrophe that medical textbooks said was inevitable. Lieutenant Betty Wilson, one of the nurses assigned to Red's care, later provided testimony for military records that offered insight into his mental state during those early days. She described him as being in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to respond to questions with small nods or attempted words, sometimes lost in delirium. But even in his delirious states, he kept asking about his crew. Had they made it back? Were they safe? Was anyone else hurt? Wilson eventually was able to tell him that all 11 other crew members of Able 13 had survived without serious injury. This news seemed to have a visible effect on Red. His vital signs stabilized further. He began eating small amounts of food, a critical milestone since burn patients require enormous caloric intake to fuel the healing process, and Red had been unable to eat solid food due to his facial injuries. The medical team had been feeding him through a tube, but now he was managing liquids and pureed foods. On the 4th day after surgery, Captain Simmerl arrived at the hospital. He had spent the previous 3 days filing reports, answering questions from command about why he had aborted the mission, and dealing with the bureaucratic machinery of the military. But he had made time to visit Red every day, sitting beside the bed even when Red was unconscious, talking to the bandaged figure about the crew, about the mission, about anything except the probability of death. During this visit, Red was lucid. Simmerl later recounted the conversation in a letter to Red's mother that has since been preserved in archives. Red, speaking through bandages and destroyed tissue, managed to ask if Simmerl was in trouble for breaking formation. Simmerl assured him that any trouble was minor and temporary. Red then asked, and this question would haunt Simmerl for decades, whether he would be of any use when he recovered, or whether he would be just a burden. Simmerl's response was immediate and firm. He told Red that he was recommending him for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. He told Red that what he had done, picking up that burning bomb, crawling through the aircraft blind and on fire, getting it out the window, had saved 12 lives, including his own. He told Red that he had already been useful in ways that most men never would be in their entire lives, and that whatever came next, Red Irwin would never be a burden. The administrative machinery of the United States military in 1945 moved with surprising speed when motivated. Captain Simmerl's recommendation for the Medal of Honor, submitted on August 8, 1945, began moving through channels immediately. Normally, such recommendations required months of investigation, witness testimony, and review at multiple command levels. Red Irwin's case was processed in 3 weeks. Part of the urgency came from the medical prognosis. Despite Red's unexpected survival past the first 72 hours, doctors still believed his death was probable. There was precedent for posthumous medals of honor, but military leadership, particularly General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the 20th Air Force, felt strongly that if Red Irwin was going to receive the decoration, he should receive it while he could comprehend what it meant. On August 27, 1945, Brigadier General Loris Norstad flew to Iwo Jima to present the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Henry Red Irwin. The ceremony took place in Red's hospital room, with his crew members present, along with medical staff and military photographers. Red, still heavily bandaged and blind, was propped up in his bed for the presentation. The citation read by General Norstad described the events of August 6 in language that seemed inadequate to the reality. It spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty, and utter disregard for his own safety. It mentioned the 22 seconds between the malfunction and the bomb's disposal. Though investigators would later note that this might have been an underestimate, some believed Red's actions took closer to 45 seconds, though the chaos and smoke made precise timing impossible to determine. What the citation couldn't capture was the medical impossibility of what Red had done. Dr. Steinberg, who attended the ceremony, later wrote in a medical journal article that the pain Red must have experienced during those seconds, pain from active phosphorus burns consuming his face and hands, should have triggered immediate unconsciousness or death from shock. The human nervous system, Steinberg wrote, has built-in protective mechanisms that shut down brain function when pain crosses certain thresholds, preventing people from continuing to function during catastrophic trauma. Somehow, Red's nervous system had either overridden or ignored these mechanisms. The question of how Red managed to function through such injuries became a topic of discussion in military medical circles for years afterward. Some attributed it to adrenaline and the body's fight-or-flight response. Others suggested that the severity of the burns actually worked in Red's favor, that the nerve endings were destroyed so quickly that he was in shock before his brain could fully process what was happening. Red himself, in later interviews, couldn't explain it. His memory of the event remained fragmentary. He remembered pulling the pin on the phosphorus bomb. He remembered the impact and the beginning of the pain. Then his next clear memory was waking up in the hospital days later. The medal ceremony lasted 15 minutes. General Norstad pinned the Medal of Honor to Red's pillow. He couldn't pin it to Red's hospital gown without causing pain, and shook the hands of each crew member, thanking them for their service. Photographers captured images of the bandaged figure in the hospital bed, surrounded by his crew. These photographs would later become iconic, representing both the horror of war and the extraordinary courage individuals could display in impossible circumstances. After the ceremony, Red asked to speak privately with Captain Simmerl. The medical staff cleared the room, leaving the two men alone. What they discussed remained between them for nearly 40 years, until Simmerl finally shared it during an interview in the 1980s. Red had asked Simmerl to promise him something, that if he became too disabled, if he became what Red called just a vegetable, Simmerl would tell Red's family not to waste their lives taking care of him. Simmerl refused to make that promise. He told Red that he would live or die on his own terms, and that Simmerl's job was to help him live, not to help him give up. The journey from being awarded the Medal of Honor to actually going home took Red Irwin another 13 months. In September 1945, he was transferred from Iwo Jima to the larger naval hospital in Guam, where more sophisticated burn treatment was available. There he underwent the first of what would eventually total 41 reconstructive surgeries over the next several years. The surgical team in Guam, led by Commander Patricia Walsh, one of the few female surgeons in the Navy at that time, began the painstaking work of rebuilding what was left of Red's face. They performed skin grafts using tissue from his legs and back. They reconstructed his nose using cartilage from his ribs. They created artificial eyelids from skin grafts to protect the empty sockets where his eyes had been. Each surgery carried risks: infection, tissue rejection, complications from anesthesia in a patient whose body had been through enormous trauma. Red's hands presented perhaps the most difficult challenge. The phosphorus had consumed most of the soft tissue, leaving bone, tendon, and scar tissue. Walsh and her team performed multiple surgeries to preserve as much function as possible. But the reality was that Red would never have normal use of his hands again. The best they could hope for was enough finger mobility to allow him to feed himself and perform basic tasks. Physical therapy began in November 1945 and continued for months. Red had to learn to navigate as a blind man in a world he could no longer see. He had to build strength back into muscles that had atrophied during months of bed rest. He had to learn to use his damaged hands, working through pain as tendons and scar tissue were slowly stretched and manipulated. The therapists who worked with him later described him as the most determined patient they had ever encountered. He never complained. He never asked for breaks. He simply worked hour after hour, day after day. By March 1946, Red was deemed well enough to be transferred stateside to a veterans hospital in Birmingham, Alabama, closer to his home in Bessemer. The transfer itself was an ordeal, a multi-stage journey involving ambulance transport, aircraft flights, and careful coordination to ensure his medical needs were met throughout. When the ambulance finally pulled up to his family's modest home on April 2, 1946, his mother Betty and father Lloyd were waiting on the front porch. Betty Irwin later told reporters from the Birmingham News that she had prepared herself for the worst. The military had sent letters describing Red's injuries, and she had seen the photographs from the medal ceremony. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of seeing her son, the boy who had left home less than 2 years earlier with a full head of red hair and a ready smile, returned to her as a blind man whose face bore only faint resemblance to the features she had known. The reunion, by all accounts, was emotional but restrained. Red had specifically asked his family not to cry when they saw him, telling them in letters that he needed their strength, not their pity. Betty honored that request, greeting her son with a firm hug and the simple statement, "Welcome home, Henry. We're proud of you." It was the first time since his injury that anyone had called him by his given name, rather than his nickname or rank. Red's adjustment to civilian life proved far more difficult than his physical recovery. The Birmingham Veterans Hospital continued his reconstructive surgeries and physical therapy, but these addressed only the visible injuries. The psychological impact of what he had experienced, the trauma of the burning, the loss of his vision, the fundamental change in his identity from an active 23-year-old to a disabled veteran, created challenges that 1940s medicine was ill-equipped to handle. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be formally recognized as a medical condition for another 30 years, but Red exhibited many of its symptoms. He experienced nightmares that left him screaming and disoriented. He struggled with feelings of worthlessness, convinced that he was a burden on his family despite their constant reassurances. He went through periods of deep depression where he refused to eat or engage with the world around him. The Veterans Administration, working within the limited understanding of mental health that existed in that era, could offer little beyond basic counseling and sedatives. What ultimately helped Red find his footing was purpose. In late 1946, he was approached by a representative from the Veterans of Foreign Wars who asked if he would be willing to speak at schools and civic organizations about his experiences. Red initially refused, believing he had nothing valuable to say. But Captain Cimarral, who had stayed in touch through regular letters and phone calls, encouraged him to try it once. If he hated it, he could stop. Red's first public speech, delivered to a high school assembly in Birmingham on November 11, 1946, Veterans Day, lasted 12 minutes and left many in the audience in tears. He spoke about duty, about the crew members who became his family, about the split-second decision to pick up the burning bomb rather than let his friends die. He spoke about the price of freedom and the debt owed to those who served. But most powerfully, he spoke about choosing to live even when living was hard, about finding purpose even when the path forward seemed dark. The speaking engagements multiplied. Red became a regular presence at schools, veterans organizations, and civic groups throughout Alabama and eventually across the South. He learned to use his blindness and his scars not as sources of shame, but as powerful teaching tools. Children who saw his damaged hands and reconstructed face understood viscerally what war cost. Adults who heard his story, particularly the detail about those 22 seconds, grasped something essential about human courage and sacrifice. In 1948, Red enrolled at the University of Alabama using benefits from the GI Bill. His goal was to earn a degree in education, preparing himself for a career as a teacher or counselor working with disabled veterans. The university, uncertain how to accommodate a blind student with limited hand function, initially tried to dissuade him from enrolling. Red, who had crawled through fire while burning alive, was not easily dissuaded. The university relented, and Red became one of the first severely disabled veterans to attend the institution. His college experience was grueling. He had to memorize lectures since he couldn't take notes. He had to dictate papers to volunteer assistants since he couldn't write. He had to navigate a campus designed for sighted, able-bodied students while blind and working with damaged hands. It took him 6 years instead of the standard 4, but in June 1954, Henry Eugene Irwin walked across a stage, guided by a student assistant, and received his bachelor's degree in social services. The same year he graduated, Red married Betty McQueen, a nurse he had met at the Birmingham Veterans Hospital. Their courtship had been unconventional. Red later joked that he had proposed to her before he ever saw her properly, since he learned to know her through her voice, her touch, and her unwavering patience during his physical therapy sessions. They would remain married for 51 years and have 4 children together. Red spent the next 3 decades working for the Veterans Administration, counseling returning veterans from Korea and Vietnam. He became particularly effective working with newly disabled veterans, Men who were struggling with the same questions of identity and purpose that he had faced. His approach was direct and unsentimental. He would sit across from a veteran, show them his hands, and say, "This is what I look like. I've had 41 surgeries. I'm blind. I have chronic pain every single day. And I have a good life. You can too, but you have to decide to fight for it." The crew of Able 13 remained close throughout their lives. They held reunions every 5 years, gathering to share stories and reconnect. Captain Simmerl, who went on to a successful career in commercial aviation, always insisted that these reunions happen in locations accessible to Red. No second-floor walk-up venues, no places that would be difficult for a blind man to navigate. At the 50th reunion in 1995, only 6 of the original 12 crew members were still alive, but all 6 made the journey to Birmingham to celebrate with Red. Red never spoke extensively about what he was thinking during those 22 seconds when he held the burning bomb. Interviewers asked him countless times over the decades, journalists, historians, students, fellow veterans. His answer remained remarkably consistent. "I wasn't thinking. I was doing what needed doing. Any of those 11 other men would have done the same for me. I just happened to be the one holding the bomb." Medical experts who studied his case continued to debate how he managed to function through injuries that should have incapacitated him instantly. Research papers published in military medical journals examined his case alongside similar incidents from other conflicts. The consensus eventually emerged that Red represented an extreme outlier, a statistical anomaly where some combination of adrenaline, shock, psychological conditioning, and perhaps simple human will pushed past the normal limitations of the body's response to trauma. Henry Eugene Red Irwin died on January 16, 2002, at the age of 80 in Birmingham, Alabama. He was survived by his wife Betty, 4 children, 9 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. His funeral, held at the First Baptist Church of Birmingham, was attended by over 800 people, including 3 surviving members of his B-29 crew, veterans from multiple wars, and political leaders from across Alabama. In the eulogies delivered that day, speakers struggled to capture the essence of what Red Irwin represented. They talked about heroism and sacrifice. They referenced the Medal of Honor and the dramatic story of August 6, 1945. They mentioned his decades of service to disabled veterans. But perhaps Captain Anthony Simmerl, himself 91 years old and speaking from a wheelchair, came closest to articulating Red's true legacy. "Red saved 12 lives in 22 seconds, Simmerl said, his voice breaking with emotion. But that's not really what made him extraordinary. What made him extraordinary was the next 57 years, when he chose every single day to keep living, keep serving, keep giving, even though living hurt. He showed everyone who met him that courage isn't just about one dramatic moment. It's about waking up every morning and deciding to be useful, to be kind, to matter. That's the real miracle of Red Irwin." The phosphorus bomb that Red threw from the B-29 over Japan on August 6, 1945, burned for approximately 90 seconds after it hit the ground, according to estimates from the crew members who watched it fall. Red Irwin's impact on the world, measured in lives saved, veterans helped, students inspired, and understanding deepened, continues to burn brightly more than 80 years later, a testament to 22 seconds of impossible courage and a lifetime of purposeful living. Historical accounts of this event are preserved in multiple sources, including the official Medal of Honor citation, military records at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, medical reports from the Naval Hospital Guam, and extensive oral history interviews conducted with crew members and family in subsequent decades. The core facts of Red Irwin's actions on August 6, 1945, have been verified through military records and eyewitness testimony from all surviving crew members.